The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
It was bold, unapologetic, and side-splittingly funny. A sitcom so brilliantly absurd it became a cult classic after just 12 episodes. Fawlty Towers didn't just push boundaries. It mocked them, marched past them, and then tripped over them with a smirk. But somewhere amid the chaos, one particular scene crossed an invisible line, one that would never be uncrossed. So, what exactly was in that infamous moment that led to the show's quiet disappearance? Stick around as we uncover the scene that brought Fawlty Towers crashing down. The real hotel horror that sparked a comedy legend. It was meant to be just another place to crash, nothing fancy, just a decent hotel in a sleepy seaside town. The year was 1970, and the Monty Python team had descended on Torquay to shoot Flying Circus. But what they found instead wasn't just accommodation. It was a surreal, borderline absurd lesson in how not to run a hotel. And for John Cleese, it was the birthplace of one of British television's most iconic disasters, Basil Fawlty. Now imagine this. You walk into a hotel after a long trip, looking forward to rest. Instead, you're met by a man so suspicious and hostile, you start wondering if you're being secretly filmed. That was Donald Sinclair, the real-life manager of the Gleneagles Hotel, who somehow made paranoia and customer service go hand in hand. He wasn't merely rude, he was theatrically erratic. He treated guests like invaders and questioned their every move as though each one might be plotting against him. One moment that left the Pythons in stunned disbelief. Eric Idle had briefly left his briefcase in the lobby. Instead of doing what any sane hotelier might, politely asking who it belonged to, Sinclair assumed the worst. Without hesitation, he grabbed the case and lobbed it over a garden wall, convinced it was a bomb. Not exactly a warm welcome, and certainly not the kind of security policy you'd expect from a hospitality professional. But that wasn't an isolated incident. When Terry Gilliam used his knife and fork the wrong way, Sinclair stormed over to correct his table manners, as though poor utensil etiquette were a criminal offense. Complaints from guests were often met with open contempt. Instead of solving problems, Sinclair added to them, creating an atmosphere that was as comically unbearable as it was real. John Cleese was baffled and amused. Here was a man so impossibly wrong for the job, so unintentionally ridiculous, that Cleese couldn't help but observe him with a comedian's curiosity. There was something oddly brilliant in Sinclair's disaster class in hospitality. Cleese took notes, literal ones. Years later, with co-writer and then-wife Connie Booth, he would channel all of that madness into a character who would become a television legend. Basil Fawlty, the hilariously dysfunctional hotel manager at the center of Fawlty Towers, was born not from fiction, but from this bizarre reality. Cleese exaggerated the quirks, of course. Basil's tantrums, his endless passive-aggressive jabs, and his tragic inability to handle stress were turned up for comic effect. But the core of Basil, his suspicion, social awkwardness, and talent for offending everyone, came straight from Sinclair. The series itself ran for just 12 episodes between 1975 and 1979, but it left a mark few sitcoms ever achieve. Every chaotic misunderstanding, every meltdown behind the reception desk was a tribute to that bewildering experience in Torquay. Ironically, Sinclair never fully grasped that he had inspired the show. He passed away in 1981, apparently unaware that his misguided management style had been immortalized in British comedy. But while Fawlty Towers gained legendary status, the real story behind its origin remains stranger and funnier than fiction. It wasn't crafted in a writer's room out of thin air. It began with a chance encounter in a town no one expected to remember, inside a hotel no one expected to talk about. And the man who inspired it all? He thought he was running a tight ship when, in fact, he was captaining the Titanic of customer service. Yet for John Cleese, this was only the beginning. Before Fawlty Towers, before Basil, and before the accolades, how exactly did his journey start? Stay tuned to unravel the full story. The making of John Cleese. From chaos to Cambridge, the making of John Cleese. Long before the Monty Python madness and Basil Fawlty's hotel disasters, John Cleese was navigating the quiet seaside town of Weston-super-Mare. He was the only child of Reginald Cleese, an insurance salesman with a dislike for the family's original surname, Cheese. Thinking it far too ridiculous for an army man, Reginald officially traded Cheese for Cleese in 1923, a decision that would later match the peculiar charm of his son's comic legacy. At school, Cleese was towering over his classmates, literally. By 13, he was already more than 6 feet tall, his gangly presence a source of attention before his wit ever was. But behind the awkward height and the school uniforms, something else was brewing. His early education at St. Peter's Preparatory School, paid for by a family inheritance, planted 2 essential seeds: a love for language and a sharp eye for human behavior. He wasn't just a clever boy excelling in cricket and boxing. He was already studying the absurdities of life, albeit unknowingly. The classroom, however, wasn't enough to contain his curiosity. A statue prank during his time at Clifton College hinted at the kind of humor Cleese would come to master: dry, visual, and oddly intellectual. He painted footprints leading away from a statue of Field Marshal Haig, as if it had wandered off to the bathroom. Juvenile mischief, perhaps, but even then, it was storytelling through farce. Still, not all moments were humorous. When Cleese discovered, at 17, that he had been passed over for a house prefect position despite his academic success, it left a mark. In his own words, it shifted his view of fairness and respect, something that would echo in the satirical lens through which he later examined authority figures and institutions. With university places under pressure due to the end of national service, Cleese had to delay his dream of attending Cambridge. Instead, he returned to his old prep school, not as a student, but as a teacher of Latin, science, English, and history. Ironically, the Latin lessons he once taught would find their way into Life of Brian, where Cleese's character famously corrects the grammar of anti-Roman graffiti. Every odd detour in his path somehow became part of his creative arsenal. Eventually, he claimed his spot at Downing College, Cambridge, to study law. But fate had other plans. At a student fair, the Footlights Theatre Club asked if he could sing or dance. No, Cleese said bluntly, adding that if there was anything worse than his dancing, it was his singing. So what do? They asked. I make people laugh. And that, quite literally, was his foot in the door. At Footlights, Cleese crossed paths with future collaborators Tim Brooke-Taylor, Bill Oddie, and the one who would change everything, Graham Chapman. Together, they began crafting the kind of strange, cerebral, and anarchic comedy that would go on to reshape British television. Even after graduating with a law degree in 1963, Cleese's father continued sending him newspaper ads for retail management jobs, just in case this comedy thing didn't work out. Still, one question remains: how did this academically gifted, prank-pulling schoolboy transform into a comedic powerhouse before Fawlty Towers ever aired? Stay tuned to unravel the full story. A brilliant mess of genius and marriage. Fawlty Towers, a brilliant mess of genius and marriage. If you ever wondered how a hotel run by a man on the brink of madness became one of the most beloved sitcoms in British history, it wasn't because John Cleese had a solo stroke of brilliance. Instead, it began with a marriage, not one built to last, but one that sparked creative magic. Cleese and his then-wife Connie Booth took a real-life experience so hilariously disastrous it stuck with them for years and turned it into something unforgettable. It all started during a notorious stay at the Gleneagles Hotel in Torquay, where Cleese found the hotel manager so ridiculously rude and incompetent that it bordered on satire. Most people would just leave a bad review, but Cleese and Booth saw something else: comedy gold. The idea of a short-fused hotel owner tangled in chaos refused to fade, and soon the seeds for Fawlty Towers were planted. But rather than just make a show about a cranky innkeeper, the duo sharpened every moment with wit, confusion, and characters so outrageous they somehow felt real. When the show first aired on BBC in 1975, it didn't exactly charm the critics. One called it a disaster, confused by its fast-paced humor and absurd scenarios. But the public? They understood. Audiences immediately clicked with the manic energy of Basil Fawlty, Cleese's towering bundle of nerves and fury, alongside the sharp-tongued Sybil, the ever-grounded Polly, and poor, hapless Manuel, who turned every misunderstanding into an explosive mess. What made the show truly stand out wasn't just the slapstick chaos, but the intricate timing and farcical tension in every scene. Each episode was a powder keg of confusion, pride, and barely restrained hysteria. Ironically, for something so beloved, the BBC nearly pulled the plug after just 6 episodes. But reruns and growing word of mouth made executives reconsider. By 1979, for years after the first season, a second and final batch of episodes aired. Only 12 episodes were ever made, yet those dozen entries sealed the show's place in television history. Behind the scenes, the story was less cheerful. By the time they began filming the second series, Cleese and Booth were already divorced. Still, they pressed on as creative partners, determined to finish what they started. It was the last time they would work together, but their final act was anything but bitter. Together, they closed the curtain on Fawlty Towers in style, their artistic chemistry unbroken even if their marriage wasn't. Even now, decades later, the show's humor feels fresh. It's quoted, studied, and still watched by new generations who can't help but laugh at Basil's escalating fury or Manuel's innocent confusion. Fawlty Towers prove that chaos, especially the kind born from two people trying to turn disaster into comedy, can be timeless. And somehow, through that blend of awkward hotel service, frayed nerves, and pure farce, Cleese and Booth managed to give the world a sitcom that never checked out. The genius of Fawlty Towers. The lasting genius of Fawlty Towers. Though only 12 episodes were ever made, Fawlty Towers carved out a legacy far larger than its modest runtime, and this is where its magic refuses to fade. When Fawlty Towers premiered in 1975, the response from television critics was more puzzled than pleased. Some dismissed the show as chaotic and incoherent, unable to grasp that the mayhem was precisely the point. But while critics hesitated, audiences locked in. They didn't just get it, they couldn't get enough of it. There was something almost painfully relatable about watching Basil Fawlty fumble through each day, convinced he was in control while the universe clearly had other plans. John Cleese's portrayal of Basil wasn't just funny, it was a masterclass in barely contained rage and misplaced ambition. Basil wasn't evil or cruel by design. He was simply trapped in a fantasy of refinement he could never quite live up to. That inner tension, his desperate desire to impress upper-class guests while being fundamentally incapable of hiding his own snobbery, turned each episode into a ticking time bomb. But the real brilliance of Fawlty Towers wasn't in the explosions, it was in the way it made every collapse feel both absurd and oddly tragic. Basil wasn't suffering alone. His sharp-tongued wife Sybil, played to perfection by Prunella Scales, knew exactly how to deflate his ego with a single line. Polly, the sensible maid portrayed by Connie Booth, often appeared to be the only adult in the building. And then there was Manuel, the hapless, eager-to-please waiter played by Andrew Sachs, whose constant confusion made every situation more unmanageable and every punchline more explosive. None of it was tidy, and that was the point. The hotel's disasters weren't isolated gags, they were extensions of Basil's inner mess. Beneath the slapstick, the show explored themes of class, insecurity, and human folly. Basil wanted so badly to run a respectable establishment, to be taken seriously, to rise above his station. But the harder he tried, the more everything fell apart. And yet, that mess was meticulously crafted. Each episode, though packed with chaos, was tightly written and perfectly timed. The jokes didn't just land, they ricocheted. The pacing was relentless, the energy unstoppable. It was a kind of comedy that demanded attention and rewarded it generously. Still, despite its brilliance, Fawlty Towers was a gamble. After airing just 6 episodes, the BBC wasn't convinced it was worth continuing. It wasn't until reruns began attracting larger and more devoted audiences that the network gave the green light for a second and final series in 1979. In total, only 12 episodes were made. But in that small number, Cleese and Booth captured lightning in a bottle. Over time, the critics reversed course. What was once seen as a misfire became a gold standard. In 2000, the British Film Institute named it the greatest British TV series of all time. Today, nearly half a century later, Fawlty Towers remains one of the most quoted, adored, and referenced sitcoms in history. And though it was built on miscommunication, mishaps, and mounting tension, its legacy is clear. Some disasters are too good to clean up. But what made one episode out of just 12 explode into infamy, and why does it still spark debate decades later? Stick around to find out.